Hello, listening audience. This is Michael Cross here with another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions, where we like to dig much deeper than you'll generally find in the mainstream media and find out what's really going on out there in society, in every level of society. And before I begin, just encourage people to check out my website. There'll be a link on this page, and become a subscriber and keep updated on new shows. Now, tonight we are going to deal with something that is quite interesting, and that's economics. No, wait now, people, don't shut off there thinking this is going to be one of those lectures like you had in college or high school economics class, okay? This gets into a lot more details than that. In fact, how supply and demand deals with the dating scene. Okay, so tonight's guest is John Birger. He's an award-winning writer, contributor to Fortune magazine, and the author of a book called Date-onomics, and basically how dating became a lopsided numbers game. And John's a senior writer at Fortune for like 5 years, where he wrote feature articles or stories on Apple, Priceline, Royal Dutch Shell, Silicon Valley's Always On Network named him to its list of power players in technology and business media. And John's writing has appeared in Fast Company, The Washington Post, Barron's, Money, Time Magazine, and the New York Magazine. And, hey, he's been all over the place when it comes to the media. CNN, Fox, BBC, you name it. So, without further ado, John, welcome to the show.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, now, as I told the audience there, hopefully they're still on here because it's economics, how basically does supply and demand have anything to do with modern dating?
Well, let me start by giving you kind of the backstory of how a Fortune writer ends up doing a book on dating. Is that okay?
Okay, go.
So, in my regular job, I write about more boring things like the stock market or oil and gas, usually for Fortune. But I couldn't help but notice that the editorial staff at Fortune was more women than men. But the men were generally either married like myself or involved in long-term relationships, whereas the women, who all seemed to have much more going for them dating-wise, which is my way of saying that they were more attractive and had bigger personalities, etc. They weren't. Most of them were single, and they had these dating stories and dating histories that just made no sense to me. They just had guys who would never call them back, or boyfriends who cheated on them, or a couple of them claimed to never get asked out on dates at all. And my goal with the book was to try to figure out why this imbalance existed, why dating was so much harder for women, and particularly in cities like New York, but really in every Western country, why dating was so much harder for young women than for young men. And the answer really boils down to supply and demand and to demographics. So for the past 15 years, we've had 4 women graduate from college in the U.S., but really throughout the Western world. 4 women graduate from college for every 3 men. And I know in Europe it's, like we use college here in the U.S. as a synonym for university, but so I guess there would be 4 women graduating from university for every 3 men. And it's been that way for 15 years. And at the same time, both men and women have become more focused on dating people like them educationally. In other words, there's been an increase in what academics like to refer to as assortative mating. In other words, university grads tend to date and marry other university grads. So as a result, we now have a dating pool with 4 women for every 3 men. And that doesn't just make it statistically more challenging for women to find a match, but it changes dating behavior too. So the same way if you're shopping for cars, and you have all these great deals out there. You're going to try to, you're not going to put as much effort into paying up for the most expensive car if you have a million good deals available to you. And while it's not exactly apples to apples, there's something similar going on in the dating market today in which men have so many choices when it comes to educated women that sometimes choices just aren't made. It's, I call it, and lots of people call it, the paradox of choice.
Mm-hmm. I've often in instructing psychology, and when we're dealing with such things as relationships, I've often asked the question, and this is in Europe actually, asked the question and asked for it to be answered honestly. First, I asked the guys, would you date someone when you're when you're at a university, would you date someone who doesn't have a university degree or their job is far less than yours when it comes to the, status? And generally speaking, there's a lot of guys that say, sure, why not? But then when I ask the same question to the females, you get like this kind of embarrassed chuckling, and a couple of them raise their hands. But often, many of them will say, there is absolutely no way I would date below my educational or occupational status. You've seen that, haven't you, in your research?
I've seen it. Well, I've heard it. The irony is that the data shows at least when it comes to marriage. Now, dating and sex is different, but when it comes to marriage, the irony is that the data in the U.S. shows the exact opposite. So there's a greater number of educated women married to lesser educated men than there are educated men married to lesser educated women, which is the exact opposite of what we think of it. I agree that if you ask that question to a group of men and women, you'll get exactly the answer you just described. But in practice, it plays out differently. And my take on this is that men think about dating differently than they think about marriage. So if the question is who are they willing to have sex with, the college thing may not be that important. But the college thing and the educational background, according to the numbers, is just as important for men as it is for women. Okay. When it comes to marriage.
Could you please explain what you mean by the difference when it comes to men and for women? What's the difference then, not just sex, between just dating and looking for a future spouse?
Well, the data on, there have been multiple studies on what sociologists call assortative mating. And there's been a 50-year trend in the U.S. Towards people, for educated people, college-educated people, only being willing to, or increasingly being unwilling to date or marry people who do not have a college degree. So, and this applies to men and women. But from a men's perspective, men don't get penalized for this kind of classism, so to speak, because the supply of college-educated women is so large. Women, however, do get penalized because they're limiting themselves to a smaller market of college-educated men.
Okay, and so maybe when the person's just out there just trying to find someone to be with, they're going to have different expectations than when they're actually looking for someone to be with, their whole life.
Yeah, I mean, this also could reflect what people are willing. When you ask this question, I assume it's not in private; it's in a group setting, correct?
Yeah.
So it could be that people answer questions differently in group settings, given that they're going to be judged on the answer, and it may not always reflect what their true feelings are. My feeling is that, particularly when it comes to all things related to love, sex, and romance, that you have to kind of take an extra hard look at the survey data and what people say, particularly in public settings, because there's both what they believe and what they want people to perceive that they believe.
Okay. whole bunch of stuff I want to deal with, but now that you brought up the thing about what people say they want and what they actually want, you've written about how religion plays into this whole thing, right?
Yeah, I have.
Okay. There's kind of this idea that this lopsided situation with men and women is really playing out amongst conservative religious groups. I mean, you might Orthodox Jews, Mormons, and so forth. Explain how that works then in reference to when people are looking for someone to settle down with.
Well, so the reason I ended up writing about religious groups was that as I was working on the main part of the book, I had a lot of people tell me, well, it's not about sex ratios. It's just that the culture has changed and that the whole dating culture is looser and that's what's going on. And, I'm not trying to be the moral majority here. I'm not criticizing the hookup culture or endorsing marriage or anything like that. But what I don't accept is that the culture changes for no reason, which seems to be the argument that people would make, that somehow or other things naturally flow from conservative, social arrangements to looser ones. And I don't believe that things change for no reason. So what I wanted to do is look at conservative groups, in this case religious groups, where I could pretty definitively say that the reason the dating culture is changing, it's not because of rap videos or because of Tinder or any of the other things that people like to blame for the dating culture becoming less monogamous. I wanted to show that lopsided gender ratios affect God-fearing people in largely the same way they affect secular people. So I ended up looking at two ultra-conservative religious groups, members of the LDS Church in Utah, the Mormon Church in Utah, and also ultra-Orthodox Jews, mostly in the U.S. And for different reasons, in both of those communities, there are now many more marriage-age women than marriage-age men. And the effect on the dating culture has been very similar to what you see in the secular world. The men have all the power, and they exploit this power to the disadvantage of women.
Okay, so even in conservative religious groups, you may find that women might do more than you would expect in order to keep a man.
There's a website out there, realself.com, which is kind of like the leading consumer information site for plastic surgery. And according to Real Self, Salt Lake City, Utah leads the nation in breast implants per capita.
Mm-hmm. So if you're looking for that guy, you got to do what you got to do.
Right. And Salt Lake, Utah obviously is the center of the Mormon Church. There's basically 50% more marriage-age women than marriage-age men in the Mormon Church, and as a result, the marriage market has become far more competitive for women. And one of the upshots is that the Salt Lake City has an outlandish number of plastic surgeons per capita.
Okay, so I'm just thinking this here too, from a psychological standpoint. If you throw in the idea where you have a large number of women and a small number of men, and of course, I know we're talking Salt Lake, but it's probably still monogamous.
It's monogamous by secular standards, but I interviewed a lot of Mormon singles, and it's clear that the oversupply of women is kind of chipping away at traditional values. I had one woman who just graduated from BYU told me that, well, BYU students don't think of oral sex as being actual sex. And that would have been certainly not the view at BYU 20 years ago. And there clearly is a more sexualized dating culture in Utah than there was 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's not the Upper East Side of Manhattan by any stretch of the imagination, but it's clearly different than it used to be.
But if you have a guy, for instance, that sees this oversupply, I don't know what you'd call it, like the Charlie effect from 2.5 Men. You know, you're going to realize that it's a buyer's market, and you just have to say the right things to someone, like, oh, I really love families, or I really, I would like to find that real special soulmate. But at the same time, you might be saying that to 3 or 4 different women. Hello?
So the question is whether men are doing this consciously, as you are describing, or, and I kind of lean towards the latter explanation, or does the entire culture change when women are in oversupply? Does everybody buy into a less monogamous, more promiscuous dating culture, men and women, when women are in oversupply? And I lean more towards the latter. I don't think men or women are going around doing a head count and then adjusting their behavior accordingly. I think what happens is, you enter a dating world and it's kind of a when in Rome phenomenon, that you're entering a dating world in which it's already more sexualized and less monogamous because of the oversupply. And if you're just a young person kind of coming of age dating wise, that's all you know. And where you really see this is in colleges in the U.S. In the book, I did a study of 35 major public and private colleges, ranking them by their sex ratios, from schools that are more men than women to those that are more women than men, and then pairing that data with how students talk about the dating culture at their schools. So there's a student-authored college review site called College Prowler, that's the book, or niche.com, which is the website. And it's basically written for kids applying to colleges. And it'll tell you everything from what the academics are like to what the football team's like, what the cafeteria food is like, or what the dating scene is like. And it's very clear from my research that the schools that are mostly women, are 60% female, 3 women for every 2 men, have a very sexualized dating culture, whereas the ones like Georgia Tech or Caltech that are 60% male have very traditional, very monogamous dating cultures. And I don't think freshmen are arriving at Georgia Tech doing a head count and then saying, oh, I'm a woman, I'm going to hold out, or I'm a man, I'm going to treat her better. I just think these young people arrive into a pre-existing culture and then join in.
Mm-hmm. And this ratio is probably even exacerbated by the idea. Now, I think you probably have run across the idea that many young men, more so than young women, I believe, are finding substitutes to relationships. I mean, the gaming culture, pornography, these kinds of things make the idea of settling down a little bit less attractive.
I mean, I guess I kind of agree. I mean, I do believe that young men in particular are there's kind of an extended childhood for them, in which it takes them a while to enter full-fledged adulthood, and maybe the gaming culture, is representative of that. But in my mind, this has a lot to do with the sex ratios, because the research on this shows that whichever gender is in the majority statistically tends to be more hardworking, more entrepreneurial, earn more, etc. So in an environment in which young men are graduating from college and don't have to compete for women because women are so plentiful, the idea of living at home with mom and dad and playing video games all night, that might be okay, because they can still find girls who will go out on dates with them. But what I will say, if you spend any time in Silicon Valley, where the demographics are the reverse, I'm sure they are playing video games there, but there are no happy couch potato guys in Silicon Valley. those guys are working their asses off, working 50, 60, 70 hours a week. And that's because the way, when men are in oversupply, the way you impress a woman is by earning more and being more ambitious. So I firmly believe that some of what we're talking about in terms of guys, kind of acting in immature ways is a direct consequence of the sex ratio.
Interesting. So you're saying that when there is an oversupply of males, they have to go into that whole evolutionary psychology, peacock feathers, bigger antler type approach to be noticed. Whereas when it's reversed, the women have to show more of the they don't show the same traits, but they have to do something to attract the males that are out there.
I mean, where you really see the reverse play out is in China. There's an economist at Columbia, as you and I'm sure most of your listeners know, because of the old one-child policy in China, there's now about 20% more marriage-age men than marriage-age women in China. So it's a reverse imbalance. And this economist concluded that up to 20% of the GDP growth in China over the past 20 years has been a byproduct of the shortage of women. And men and their parents have to work harder, be more entrepreneurial, earn more in order to impress a bride. And that has supercharged the Chinese economy. And there was a LA Times story on this a couple of years ago, and there was a quote from a single woman, I believe in Shanghai, talking about dating and her expectations for men. And the expectations for most women in China, middle-class women in China, they expect a guy to own his own apartment and a new car before they'll agree to go out on a date with him. And this one young woman who was quoted in the LA Times story, I think this is verbatim, but if not, it's close. She said she would rather cry in the back of her boyfriend's BMW than smile on his bicycle.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
So you can really see in China how the shortage of women has given women there the leverage, and the way men respond to that is by working harder and earning more.
So you might actually see a situation where in the future couples will be more desirous. I know they've raised their ratio to 2 now, that you can have children without being penalized, but there may be more of a desire to have girl babies than guys.
There was a quote from a young husband, a father to be. Actually, I think it was that same LA Times story. And the reporter asked him about this, and he's about to have his first child, and his comment was, "I hope it's a girl. Boys are too expensive." And that's exactly what we're talking about here. So what happens in China is it's not just that the young men have to earn more. Their parents are kind of burdened with helping them out financially in order to impress a wife. So you have young parents to be who would actually prefer to have a girl because the financial burden of having a boy is too much. And if you know anything about Chinese culture going back many hundreds of years, this is the sea change to end all sea change, because not so long ago, having a girl was not quite a tragedy, but one level below that, while the entire village celebrated if you had a boy, and that's been embedded in Chinese culture for many hundreds of years. So in the idea that in a blink of an eye that's changed just because of the effect of gender ratios, it's remarkable.
Mm-hmm. So, how do you think that's going to be affecting the United States if these trends continue? I mean, are we going to see I just interviewed a guy. I just interviewed an author. He's a Stanford professor who was saying that biotechnology is going to come into here, and it's going to really change things in the next 20 or 30 years. Do you have any speculations on that?
I do in terms of how this is going to play out over time. I mean, obviously, if there are too few men in the college-educated dating pool, there are too many men in the working-class dating pool, and that's exactly what the numbers show. But we just don't hear about it because blue-collar guys don't write screenplays or novels or blog entries about their dating woes. But they're very real. And not long after the book came out, I got a very angry Twitter message from a doc. He's a dock worker in Philadelphia. And he said to me, and I'm cleaning up his language here, but he sent a Twitter message to me, how come nobody talks about us? He added a couple words, but how come nobody talks about us? And I responded to him and I said, you're right. In the book, I do talk about how in the working class dating pool, the numbers are reversed and there aren't enough women. But, I'm writing a dating book and men don't buy dating books, so that's my excuse. But he had a very good point. And so my belief is that going forward, we're going to see more of what I like to call mixed collar marriages. And that is educated women married to lesser educated men. And you already see this in the African American community where the gender gap in college education is much wider and much more long-standing. So if you've ever seen like a Tyler Perry movie, he's a black filmmaker, there's always some like black female corporate executive married to a mechanic with a heart of gold, that kind of thing. And I like to joke around that in a white movie, you would need like a 10-minute on-screen explanation for why Julia Roberts' doctor character was married to a fireman. But in black cinema, it's all very accepted and very matter of fact. And I kind of feel like that's where we're all headed. And that we're just all going to have to become more open-minded when it comes to marriage and kind of get over ourselves when it comes to class and education.
Well, one of the ironies is ultimately in our economy today, a lot of the mid-level management sort of jobs have been, or factory workers have been outsourced to other countries, but yet many of those kind of jobs you think of when it comes to like plumbers, for instance, they usually make more money than a college professor.
Yeah. I frequently use that almost that exact line in a lot of my speeches. I point out very true, very real. It's true that given how much I paid my plumber last year, I am sure that he makes more than me. And I see him driving around town in an Audi, so he's obviously doing fine. And I think there is this assumption that if you're a tradesman, if you're a plumber or electrician or contractor, you're poor. And that's totally, in broad terms, yes, having a college degree, is likely to lead to more wealth, but that's not true across the board. And also for young people, the 23-year-old plumber doesn't have like $150,000 in college debt. Whereas, a young guy graduating from college is saddled with a lot of debt, probably. So, so for a woman looking for a partner, having a guy who's debt free and is making a good living as a plumber, or a fireman or a policeman, that could be a good match.
But ultimately, I think wouldn't it be like if you do have those plumbers or garbage collectors and those kinds of people, these men, if they want to be dating the women who are like the executives or doctors or something, they would then maybe be advised to kind of broaden their interest into those areas too. Like, I mean, if you're a plumber, you're going to have a hard time meeting someone who is has a degree in English literature and teaches at a local community college or something.
Yeah, no, I think everybody, the plumber and the college professor, everybody needs to be more open-minded. And I also think some of these stereotypes about that people have about working class guys, I really think they refer to all guys. Like I did a radio interview with a female talk show host in Charleston, South Carolina, and we were talking about this very subject, and she interrupted me and said, well, I need a guy who'll take me to the ballet and who'll go see musicals with me. And I'm worried that a guy who didn't go to college, won't be as cultured and won't want to do that kind of stuff with me. And I said to her, look, hold on. I went to an Ivy League college. I have a master's degree. And I'm telling you, the absolute last thing in the world I want to do is go to ballet. And somewhere in my bottom 10 list is seeing a Broadway musical. And I think there's just a lot of things that, and I think a lot of guys are like this, that, there are very few guys at book club. Guys, you're not going to find a lot of guys in cooking class. You're going to find very few guys who really want to, or straight guys at least, who want to go to ballet. And I think that sometimes what women think of as being characteristics of working class guys are really characteristics of all guys.
Yeah, I actually think you're right there. But also guys should realize that, I always tell young people this. Your first date should not be to a nice French restaurant. It should be a hike in the rain, somewhere on some nature trail. And then you'll find out, you actually find out what that person's like. Because there are a lot of young women who, they may have that degree, but they enjoy fishing, hunting, and these kinds of things too.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's good advice.
So maybe actually the internet. I'm going to throw a business idea. I'm very theoretical. I throw ideas out to my students all the time, but I don't usually actually follow through with them, except for maybe writing a book or something here and there. And that is, maybe there should be dating sites set up to where they do these cross blue collar, white collar type of hookups.
In my book, I described that very thing as the one investable idea that came out of the book. So I 100% agree with you, that if I were launching a dating app or a dating business today, that's exactly what I would focus on. And I'll tell you, I got another Twitter message not long after the book came out, and it was from a woman who had been married happily for a couple of years, and she wanted to tell me that she had met her husband after she unchecked the college grad box when searching for dates on her online dating site. And I think that's actually great advice, particularly for women, that I think a lot of children of suburbia or children of educated parents, when they're checking off boxes, searching for dates online, they never even think about considering somebody who didn't go to college. And I think that, in effect, they end up eliminating a lot of people who they might just click with.
Yeah, because I've known working class. I have a master's degree, all that kind of stuff, and so I hang with that circle, but I grew up in a working class background. And I can tell you, I know working class guys who are very well read. These guys know the classics and stuff. Yeah. They really get into it, or they get into history, almost fanatical sometimes, or they really enjoy science. And the irony is that that sometimes the people, they still have those interests. They're still researching things, versus in college, you're kind of told, okay, this is your major. This is what you have to concentrate on. So you don't actually learn about other things. So there are a lot of guys out there who really are very interdisciplinary, and maybe they're even better catches than the guy who all he knows about is his particular field he studied for.
Yeah, and maybe some of them are more likely to be kind of the alpha men types you were referring to earlier, who perhaps the women don't want to admit that they would consider, but they actually do.
Yeah, because it's kind of funny, read up on the social sites and stuff like that when it comes to series that and I talk to students and they say. For instance, they say that they'll stop watching The Walking Dead if I don't know if you ever watch it, but the Daryl character, who's like the stereotypical redneck, and yet he has these giant followings of females of all educational backgrounds.
Exactly.
So, ultimately, maybe what was the name of that music video Madonna did where at the end of all these rich guys coming after her, she goes out into a pickup truck with this guy, or this was in the 80s, so.
Is this the Material Girl?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe that's something that, title of your next book. I don't know.
Maybe.
So ultimately you think that what's going to happen is there's going to be a change in our, since the 1950s, dating culture altogether.
Yeah, I mean, I was at a conference a few years ago, a dating industry conference, and one of the people I met there was David Buss, who's a professor at University of Texas, and he writes, his area of research is dating and gender and things like that, and he told me he thought that we were just going to permanently end up with a society in which a third of the women never got married because there are no men for them. And I couldn't disagree more with Professor Buss on this. I think it's inevitable that the men who don't have matches in the working class dating pool and some of the women who don't have matches in the college grad dating pool, that they will eventually find each other. And the other thing I believe over time that will happen is that that women aren't genetically smarter than men. And eventually we're going to fix the boy problem in our schools, and we'll get back to a situation in which men and women are attending college in equal numbers.
Yeah, I've actually thought, for quite some time, we had these programs that tried to get women more in, young girls interested more in science and math and those kinds of things. And that seems to have worked. So maybe we need to start doing that for men as well.
I agree. I also think there's kind of a simpler solution. I know that there are folks out there who believe that we've gone too far in the other direction, kind of what you're talking about. We've gone too far in raising up girls. The problem, and I know there's probably some anecdotal evidence of that. The problem is that this gender gap in college enrollment exists everywhere, not just in the U.S., even in China, where I guarantee you they are not putting girls' interests ahead of boys. Even in China, there are 10% more women than men in higher education. And in China, there are 20% more men overall. So that goes to show that this isn't like feminism in our schools, holding back boys. There's something else going on here. And my explanation and that of a lot of other neuroscientists who've looked at this is that the old disincentives and discrimination that used to hold back high school age girls when it came to attending college, it kind of obscured a fundamental biological truth. And that is that girls mature intellectually and socially at a faster rate than boys.
Yeah.
And I think if you're a parent, everybody kind of intuitively knows this. I mean, I have teenage boys. A 16-year-old boy is a boy. A 16 or 17-year-old girl is basically a young adult. And as a result of this maturity gap, girls are better at college preparation. They do their homework, they behave better, they pay attention more in school, etc. So there's been some research indicating that if you redshirt boys, if you hold them back a year and have them start first grade at age 7 instead of age 6, it goes a long way towards closing the academic gap, the performance gap when it comes to grades in school. And I think that's the solution. That we have to acknowledge that girls in terms of brain maturity are ahead of boys, and a 10-year-old girl is the equivalent of an 11-year-old boy.
That's a very interesting proposal there. Yeah, my point was that it wasn't that we had feminized, the schools and then.
Yeah, I know, but it's that we're, I think I hear this a lot, that there's so much attention paid to raising up girls that we've left boys behind. And I don't doubt there's some of that going on. I just don't think that's the fundamental cause of the college gender gap.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, because I know that countries, even though people have these horrible stereotypes of Iran, there's a lot of, Iran. but actually most of their college and university students are female versus male.
Yep.
So there seems to be, I think what you're saying there is there's this kind of sense that guys need to, there seems to be some sort of maturity difference that might exist for one reason or another. I'm not saying sociological, biological, whatever, but for some reason there seems to be some sort of difference there.
It is biological that neuroscience has shown that boys' brains mature at a slower rate than girls' brains. And actually the brain maturity gap doesn't really close until young men and women hit their early 20s. And again, as a parent, this is like I'm surprised I even had to read this someplace, because it's obvious to me that the girls are more mature in terms of behavior and readiness to learn than the boys are.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it could have something to do with the whole idea that biologically guys can actually, I mean, you've probably met guys that didn't even start families till they were in their 50s.
Sure.
Versus a woman usually doesn't have that ability, to suddenly decide to start a family in her 50s without the help of a lot of medical science. So therefore, there is kind of this evolutionary predisposition, perhaps.
Yes. Yeah, that sounds right to me.
Okay. In the last couple minutes here, can you tell people how they can find your book? You have a website. I'm going to link to it, but you can mention that too. And find out more details about, I mean, this sounds really, really, really fascinating.
Well, thank you. So the book is Date-onomics, How Dating Became a Lopsided Numbers Game. It's available at, most major bookstores, Barnes & Noble. You can buy it on Amazon. Let's just say it's available everywhere. How about that? And my website is date-onomics.com, and that's without a hyphen, DATEONOMICS.com. What else? And my email, if you want to reach out to me via email, is dateonomics without a hyphen @gmail.com.
And your Twitter site?
I am John, JONBIRGER, John Birger 1 that's my Twitter handle, John Birger 1.
Okay, great. And of course, for listeners out there, mine's PsychoMike777 as well. Okay, well, great. Thank you very much for this very informative interview.
You're welcome, Michael.
Anyway, what I'd like to deal with at this moment